Well, thank you so much for doing this, Howard. So the first question today is, what drew you to complete your Doctor of Philosophy at the Australian National University in 1973? What was your intended focus of inquiry at the time? Perhaps the then head of the school, Anthony Forge, was the inspiration? What brought you
Well,
here?
actually, Anthony Forge hadn't been appointed to the department when I arrived. And I was the first anthropology graduate student in the department of what was then prehistory and anthropology, before any anthropologists had arrived at the start level. So I'd applied for a doctoral scholarship probably about a year and a half before.
Mm-hmm.
And I was then working at the British Museum on a project called the No Number project, which was looking at the unregistered collections in what was then the Department of Ethnography in the British Museum. And I'd done that for 3 or 4 years. I finished my master's thesis on a set of objects from Central Australia called toas, which are wonderful, beautiful direction signs that were actually completely unknown. I got to know them because the supervisor of my master's thesis, when I handed him a theoretical treatise, said, really, you need some data. This was Peter Acco. And I said, well, all right, I'll look for some data. So I went to the Royal Anthropological Institute and looked through their pamphlet sections. I looked for data. And I found an article in the Journal of the South Australian Museum for about 1919, so a long time ago. And there were 480 illustrations of toas with their documentation. So I did my analysis of that and produced my master's thesis. And then it was a question of, well, I had a job continuing in the British Museum for a while, but I really, really wanted to do fieldwork, and in particular in the anthropology of art, which was kind of developing area at the time. And I did apply to the ANU. I saw an advertisement on the board of the tea room at the British Museum for scholarships at the ANU. Well, as at the time, scholarships at the ANU, postgraduate scholarships, were more than my British Museum salary. I thought, well, this is probably a good idea. And I wrote a application to apply linguistic models to the study of the art of Vanuatu, because that was where I was at in the registering of unregistered objects at the British Museum, and I thought Vanuatu art was wonderful.
Yeah.
So I applied to the ANU. I had heard absolutely nothing whatsoever. Then suddenly one day I got a letter before emails from John Mulvaney saying, it's come to my attention that you applied some time ago for a doctoral scholarship at the ANU. And I wonder if you would, change the topic and were interested in studying bark paintings and social change in Australia, whether you would, accept that opportunity. Now, I've never, ever in my history at the ANU of 50 subsequent years found anyone changing the topic of someone who applied for a PhD scholarship, but on that occasion, John Mulvaney did. He knew about my thesis and my work on toas. I'd been supported in that work by Bob Edwards, who was then a curator at the South Australian Museum, who'd sent me lots of photographs. And Peter Acco knew about it because he was the supervisor who told me I should look for some data, and he'd then become the principal of the Institute of Aboriginal Studies. So John Mulvaney was close to both of them. And they said, really, this chap should come over and do. So John sort of found a way of, doing that. So that's how I ended up studying bark painting. It was a tremendous surprise to Anthony Forge when he came. He'd been doing fieldwork in Bali then, when he was offered the chair at ANU. Incredible surprise to find that he'd got a doctoral student there already. So he and John Mulvaney became my supervisors. And
so they ended up steering you into your, I says, essentially Yolngu culture. You didn't choose it necessarily.
No, John Mulvaney chose bark paintings. No, what steered me to Yolngu culture was another piece of incredible serendipity. I'd actually given lectures at Chelsea School of Art in London on bark paintings. So I knew quite a lot about Yirritja bark paintings from publications and things like that. Then a very, very distinguished Australian who's incredibly unrecognised, the Reverend Edgar Wells, who had been the missionary at Manggalili, who really in the 1950s really tried to help promote the marketing of bark paintings in Europe and America, but then had been the person who had basically worked with Yolngu to have the church panels in Yirritja in the church, that then inspired the bark petition that Edgar Wells was also involved in facilitating, at which point he was more or less dismissed by the Methodist bishop, left. But he was always interested in bark paintings and collections of bark paintings and so on. So he applied to IADSIS for a grant to go and to document the collections in museums by the Reverend Chaseling. Chaseling was the founding missionary at Yirritja, and he was not a documenter of artworks, but he sent an enormous number of them to the Australian Museum in Queensland and so on. Edgar Wells was considered by the Institute not to have had the kind of museum experience in order to document works. So they wrote to him when he applied for grant. We'd be happy to give you a grant as long as you had a research assistant coming along with you called Howard Morphy, who would help you with documenting the paintings. Now, I wasn't then planning to go to Yirritja specifically, but Edgar Wells, Yirritja was one of the obvious places. With Edgar Wells, I went to Yirritja and Manggalili, but I then put in an application that I would go to Manggalili, which was the place which at that moment of time, in 1973, was the place where the artists of Western Ireland were based and beginning to develop the art centre there. You couldn't go to Gumbalanya, that was in Owenpelly, because at that time the mission had only just begun to be marketing again art, because the mission had been fairly suspicious of it. But in fact, a few years, early 1970s, Peter Carroll, who was a linguistic missionary, did start that. So I had this, plan that I followed up. It had very interesting hiccups on the way. So I don't think I'd ever flown. I'd certainly never flown to the Northern Territory before. So I arranged to meet Edgar Wells at Brisbane. And then we were going to travel up on flights together to go. And the missions had provided accommodation for us because Edgar Wells, although the mission was still slightly suspicious of him, he was someone who they had to accommodate in many ways because he was so important.
Having talked about, so you mentioned Manggalili, but I know you've worked really closely with the cooperative up in Yirritja. So, speaking of that, how would you describe the role of the artist cooperative in general within the community at Yirritja, and then is this reflective of other Aboriginal communities?
Again, these are potentially long stories. At that moment in time, the only art cooperative that was just emerging, though people didn't know very much about it, would have been Papunya Tula, which was, became a cooperative, I think in 1972, but weren't aware of it. Maningrida had an art centre just established. Maningrida was a government settlement as opposed to a mission. None of the missions had art centres as such. So the marketing of art was either the responsibility of mission staff who were interested in it, or it became something linked to the store, partly because that linked in with the way that people were being paid for their works and so on. At Yirritja, when I arrived, it was the mission store that was involved in the marketing of art. And at Maningrida, they had just started an art centre that was run by someone called Dan Gillespie, who'd started as a school teacher there. The Australia Council and the government had begun in the 1970s to see the marketing of art as being an important potential thing. So there was some funding available, and the government had already set up the Aboriginal Arts and Crafts business. And so they begun at the stage of time to facilitate creating a market, and there were some shops that were beginning to specialize. So it's very embryonic. The people at Maningrida, and it's carried on being a successful art centre, really were the first art centre in some ways to have a continuing presence until and it's partly because of the outstanding people who were then appointed to run those art centres. Dan Gillespie was very impressive. He was taken over then by Peter Cook, who was a very enterprising entrepreneurial person, a lot of them coming from backgrounds as school teachers. At Yirritja, and this will be part of a later story of what happened, at that stage there was a missionary responsible for it. And when I began my fieldwork, I, in a sense, negotiated with missionary Malcolm Thomas, and he was again pretty good, entrepreneurial, and so on and so forth. He and I sort of had a working relationship. He didn't want me to go in and outbid him for paintings, because I had got funding to buy a collection for the National Ethnographic Collection while I was there. So I worked well with him. I discussed him what sort of price he would pay for the painting, and in particular the price they would sell for. And I paid the artist the price that they would sell for. And so that worked quite well. That was in our first field trip there. Our second field trip, we arrived, there was no missionary buying because Malcolm Thomas, for certain reasons, had left Yirritja and to train as a minister in South Australia. So there was no art centre. So I arrived then without there being an art centre. So I said we'll have to sort of trace these things backwards and forwards, because you'll gather from that acquiring collections of works was part of my sort of research methodology and agenda. In advance, I knew that bark paintings was a seasonal activity. Bark painting tended to be produced from the late wet into the middle dry. After that, the bark couldn't be taken off from the trees. So I tested a lot of different kinds of paper, cardboard, and so on to see how they might work with ochres. And I discovered a board called Brennex board, which was a woven board. I chose a colour for it, which was a sort of neutral colour, which looked more like red ochre, kind that was used in others. So I bought large quantities of bread export that I came up with. This was actually a very good thing. And the bread export was about the size of an extraordinarily large human chest, because body paintings were one of the main forms in which Yolngu art was produced. In fact, there's really no difference between Yolngu paintings on the body, bark paintings, hollow log coffins, and so on and so forth. So Yolngu will produce, designs that can be used in multiple contexts. Okay, well, Brennex board was one of the things that I used when bark wasn't available to get artists to produce paintings, because my aim was to, in a sense, understand the regional system of art production. So as well as obviously recording works in the context of ceremonies, circumcision ceremonies, mortuary rituals, and so on, I then was able to build a much larger archive. And I got the funding to do that initially as part of the IATSIS grant. And those works are now part of the National Museum's collection. Then I came back and there was no art centre. No one was able to sell their art anywhere. What was I going to do? Well, obviously, the Brennex board were then in high demand because these were ones that I was buying for collection. But I had limited funds for that. So what I did was I was forced to, in a way, become an entrepreneur. And I contacted Bob Edwards, who was then the director of the Aboriginal Arts Board. And I put forward a proposal. I said, there are all these artists, wonderful, well-known artists. They have no market at the moment. What I propose is I could make a collection that we would then be able to hold an exhibition in Canberra, and we would then be able to sell the paintings. What we had decided, or I had decided, was the maximum southern price for an exhibition of actual art that was exhibited as if it was an exhibition of fine art in general. And Bob said, "Oh, that's a very good idea." So he gave me a large sort of float. And so I was able to acquire a lot of paintings, some of which you'll see now purchased by the Australian National University. ANU was very supportive. There was an incredibly supportive Vice-Chancellor, Anthony Lowe. And so they saw no problem in a graduate student organising an exhibition of commercial art. And I had a model as how I would fairly pay for the difference between local prices and southern market prices, because I said we'll return all of the difference back to the community. And that's what we did. So we held the exhibition Yirritja Art after I got back from my fieldwork. I wrote a catalogue, ANU, which then had its own graphic design centre for the university, produced superb posters. Publicity was good. Nugget Coombs was sort of very supportive then of everything, and he was very closely linked. So everything was really good. So we held the exhibition, and it was a sellout. And then when I came back to Yirritja, maybe 3 or 4 years later after, no, maybe not so long ago then, maybe about 2 years later, after I'd just written my doctorate to check it through with people, the artists just thanked me so much for returning the money. But I got that model from someone called Jim Davidson, who was one of the real pioneers in the promotion of Aboriginal art. He was a Melbourne businessman who had all sorts of interests in the Pacific, but he was passionate about Aboriginal art. And so he did exactly that same thing. And when we were there, first of all, in the field, they were waiting for Mr. Davidson to come back because he had a sort of bucket of money that he had. It's the difference between the price he paid and by the time the exhibition was held, there was then an arts advisor in place. Now, we can go then back to your question about the marketing of Aboriginal art and art centres. Well, in the interim, when I came back from the field the first time, I wrote a report to the Senate, and the Australia Council asked to do that by Bob Edwards, on the possible role of the Aboriginal Arts Board in the marketing of art from the art. And there I recommended that they created a system of arts advisors who would be mediation between remote area communities and the market, who would have a responsibility for developing the art there. The Aboriginal Arts Board would fund those particular kinds of positions and so on. So I think that my report almost certainly fitted in with the mindset of Bob Edwards. And then the following year, they started the funding art centre managers.
Wow.
So there was a guy there then, Micah Farrell, who subsequently became a curator of art. He was the second arts advisor. The first one was someone called Chris McGuigan, who was there for about 6 months or so, setting it up. He was working for the Australian Arts Board. And Micah Farrell was the person who was then able to return the money to people. And as I say, when I came back, the artist was so pleased. They said, "Oh, you're a good person," just like Jim Davidson sending the money back.
Wonderful.
So there we are. So after that, Bukalangai Mulka, since then, has really had a very, very strong history. And it's partly because it's had a succession of utterly outstanding people who had that role. I mean, they were called sort of, arts advisors. They weren't really advising artists. They were basically agents, the equivalent.
Facilitators. Yeah.
But they tended to be, well, I mean, not just facilitators. They weren't sort of facilitators in the production, theoretically, at all. They were involved with the marketing and the managing of the business. So they were business managers. But the people who opted to do it were people who'd done their degrees at schools of art and were interested. And that, I think, was very important because they had a sort of reason for being there and staying there. That was not simply making sure that the business worked, but actually having an understanding of the motivations of the artists and being able to work with them. So they did become facilitators as well.
Going along that, how did Narritjin and Banapana Maymuru come to ANU Creative Arts Fellowship recipients in 1978? And what was your involvement in supporting their art residencies here?
Well, this is, of course, you can see a film about this, which is Ian Dunlop's film, Narritjin in Canberra, which is part of a series of films he did on Narritjin in Djarrakpi, parts 1, 2, and 3. So Djarrakpi was and is Narritjin's homeland on Blue Mud Bay. Even today it takes about 5 hours to get there. The roads that much longer than that. So Narritjin was filmed both in Djarrakpi doing painting and in Canberra during his residency. So definitely something.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how did we get to the point where he was able to be filmed in Canberra? Well, obviously, ANU had an creative arts fellowship. They'd never had an Indigenous artist. So I put forward a proposal that Narritjin should be the Creative Arts Fellow. It's the Creative Arts Fellowship Committee. There's some controversy in what I'm saying there. but it's all right. It's a very well-known controversy. The application was turned down. I asked the chair of the committee, why was this turned down? It seemed to be an extraordinary opportunity. So, well, he's a traditional artist. It's not really art. It's not individual creativity. It's owned by groups. It's a group product. I said, this is nonsense, but I suppose I have to accept your decision. They did appoint someone. The following day, after I'd heard this bad news, I was phoned up by Penny Tweedy. I picked up. Hello, my name's Penny Tweedy, she said. Oh, is it Penny Tweedy? Yes, right. I've just been appointed Creative Arts Fellow for next year. Oh, I said. And she said, well, my project, I told the committee that I wanted to do a photographic record of actual communities today. And the committee said, well, why don't you get in touch with Howard Morphy? He knows things about that. I said, oh, yes. And in particular, she said, I really want to photograph Aboriginal artists. And said, and you... I said, oh, I'm sorry, the Creative Arts Fellowship Committee doesn't think there are any. I said, and she said, no, but then that was said as a joke. And I said, yeah, look, Penny, of course, I'd be really happy to talk to you. And indeed, I said, Narritjin and Maymuru, who's one of the greatest artists, was one of the people who turned that. I'm sure that she was a little bit shocked by that. And she was working with her partner then, Clive Scollay, who's who at the time was a kind of filmmaker interested in art and so on. So I said, great. But then I put the phone down. I went to see John Mulvaney, and he thought it was away. I said, John, I think now is the time that we contacted the Vice Chancellor and just related the story to him. John picked up the phone and phoned the Vice Chancellor. And at the end of that phone call, we're going to award a second fellowship this year. And then we had a kind of conversation. I phoned up Bob Evans and I said, it's going to be quite expensive because really it's important if it's going to work. It's important that Narritjin comes down with some members of his family and with his son in particular, Banapana, who's also a great artist and someone who is really, Narritjin sees us following him, and it would be good for them to come down. Bob Edwards said, yeah, very good idea. I mean, times change in some ways about how one does things. So, I mean, I went through a perfectly reasonable application process that was obviously not taken notice of, but then, I'm sure it's not different, then a sort of good idea gets funding from other sources. That's fantastic. So Narritjin came down for 2.5 months. They provided a studio for him, actually the room that's just outside Melville Hall Annex. We got bark sent down. This became his home. They rented a house for him, kind of quite close to where we lived. They provided me with a bus for 2.5 months, a small bus. And so, Francis and I really, we got on well with them. They considered us to be relatives in many ways and vice versa. So they were incredibly well and warmly received by the ANU. And then we had a closing exhibition, which was also, like the first one on Your Colour Art,
of course. So according to you, Narritjin painted the designs on the final bark petition of 1963. Yeah. Could you elaborate on the interconnectedness of Aboriginal art, culture and politics in general?
Oh gosh, that's
it's a meaty question, I know.
It's a meaty question, yeah. I mean, look, there's an incredibly close connection. I mean, one of the connections is that Aboriginal agency in engaging with non-Aboriginal people all the way across the history of the colonisation of Australia involved them opening up aspects of their culture to the visitors. So, Glenn Dinging's wonderful on Dances with Strangers says how in the Sydney context, very much there was an engagement with the colonists. And in all of those contexts, that kind of engagement ultimately turned sour because the process of colonization, the introduced diseases, the areas of conflict that developed, really, in a sense, changed those relationships at, we'll say, at a kind of institutional level. Aboriginal people became institutionalized and separated as part of the colonial process. There were individuals who still engaged very positively and closely. There were Aboriginal people who engaged positively and closely. So people like William Barrack in Victoria, who was one of the people who was there at the beginning of European colonisation in Melbourne, was someone who always acted as best as he could to maintain positive relationships as part of a process of asserting a place for Aboriginal people in this new colonial context. So Yolngu were no different at all. So Yolngu, when Donald Thompson came to North East Island Land, were producing art paintings within the community for all sorts of different kinds of reasons that we can go into. Why did Donald Thompson make this great collection? Well, Donald Thompson partly in himself saw this just as some of the early Methodist missionaries did, like T.T. Webb, as a way of showing Australians and stuff. Look, these people are highly creative. You need to recognize this as well as support us in whatever our particular project is. And so that's where a lot of those collections that are now seen as art were actually gestures of engagement and trying to get people to understand. And that, in the Yolngu case, has carried on out in a post-colonial context, which started much later, in the really 1920s, early 30s, that it's able to have had very, very significant kind of consequences. So I've written things with sort of titles like, culture of persuasion, mutual conversion, which shows how, in fact, the Yolngu, if you like, strategy of engaging others through art, because art was a major mode of communication, both within the society associated with rights in land, rights in ritual objects, and so on and so forth, but also a powerful statement of the long-term presence of Yolngu people in the land and their ancestral charter for being there. And the Bark Petition was a sign of that. But the Bark Petition came out of the paintings in the church. As the paintings in the church were ones Kim Beazley Sr. saw when he was visiting on behalf of a sort of a visit by the representative of the Australian Labor Party to Yirritja at that time. He saw those in the church, and they were there. Narritjin, in fact, was the person who suggested that Wells should be in the church, because he said, we've got your religious icons there, and I think ours should be beside. And Edgar Wells agreed, part of this mutual conversion process. And when Beazley saw them, he saw exactly the message, and obviously would have got it from talking to Narritjin, Edgar Wells, and others, that people do have documents of their own that show their title. And so, in the case, they talked to Beazley about sending a petition, and I think Beazley then said, well, why don't you send it on Bark, because this is yours. So that was a brilliant suggestion, and Yolngu obviously then took it up. And then there were a series of hiccups in the production of the Bark Petition. So there are more than the two that are in Parliament House. And the final two that were sent out were because there'd been sort of obstruction in accepting them in Parliament as to, whether these people were the right age. How do you know their signature? And the road had got through, in a sense. They knew that a couple of petitions arrived, quickly the following day, a couple of days later, which at that time was a really difficult thing to do. Then they'd be accepted. So Narritjin stayed up all night and painted the two that eventually ended up in Parliament.
Wow.
I know all about that because, in fact, the two of the Europeans who were involved, Doug Tuffin and the school teacher whose name I've suddenly forgotten, but a really great man. I recorded their history, and they were there.
Wow, wonderful.
So, and it's carried on. So, I mean, the next, great. Well, there was a small petition, which is also in Parliament House, by Tundiwoi, Wanambi, Marakulu man, when they heard that Nhulunbuy was not going to be called Nhulunbuy, but something else, probably Flinders Town, that it should retain the name that it had always had from time immemorial. So that worked. It was a very small kind of thing that the government had to do, was change the name down. But then came the saltwater paintings. And the saltwater paintings were the next great gesture that led to sea rights.
Yes. So now we're going to look at some of the works that are in the ANU collections. And so if you could please simply describe how they were made.
Maybe have a time out and get some water and then we can do this bit.
So tell us about this particular painting.
Well, it's interesting that this is the painting that's behind us while we're. I mean, it's a very important painting. Obviously, emotionally, it's very important. I mean, this is one of the paintings that was done mainly by Banapana Maymuru, Narritjin's son, during their Creative Arts Fellowship. And towards the end of the fellowship, they'd run out of bark. So this is a huge, enormous sheet of, I think, plywood, which Narritjin got a series of large. Yolngu always painted on different scales, or made art on different scales. And their painted works, the sort of largest works, the whole log coffins, which would be the height of that painting. And if you unrolled them, you'd find actually it was of similar kind of scale. So people did produce, as well as paintings on the chests of young boys for initiation. And so you can see Yolngu can produce art on scales, and very often, because the meaning of the geometric elements can expand to cover lots and lots of different references. You can have almost a little small sort of code that would be painted on someone's chest that through songs and everything else can expand to a whole landscape. Well, this is one of those paintings that actually encompasses quite a sort of large landscape. And it's an extraordinary painting. But let me first of all read Narritjin's statement at the opening of the exhibition, where this painting was not up for sale, but was a gift to the ANU. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Narritjin Maymuru, an artist fellow. I've been here for 2.5 months, and I've done all this working in bark. A very good time here. Myself, my boy Banapana, Banapana's wife, and my wife, 2 boys. We've been a very good time here in Canberra. It's been a joy to be in here. I've done lots of paintings, made spears, woomers, and everything but all got meaning in the painting. Doesn't matter, little thing or biggest thing, all's got meaning, own story. It's on your life or my life, your blood, my blood, your bone, my bone. Everything's been done here, teaching Europeans in Canberra. And so we can understand why we're traveling in life, why we're caring, why we're living. That's all my message. And this I'm going to give you in Canberra. Nobody got to pay. I just give it to Canberra. My painting, the biggest one from this Manggalili clan. Present back to you in Canberra, in this country. That's all my message. So Nugget Coombs opened the exhibition. Nugget Coombs was really a long time friend in many ways of Narritjin. And it's just a gorgeous painting. But it is a painting of the landscape at Djarrakpi, where his outstation was. And I've written basically my book, Ancestral Connections, has 3 chapters called Manggalili Iconography. And, if you want to, you can read those chapters and you'll get a very full understanding of where this painting comes from. But I can give a very simple description now that we're sitting in front of it. All Yolngu paintings involve different interpretive perspectives. They're a map of events that happened at a particular place. They're a map of a journey, and they're also a map of the landscape itself. So here we've got an event, and as an event, you have in the center of the painting there, I found where the camera is now, there's this long column, which is a tree, and it's a native cashew tree, Ganyao, and at the top of it is a bird which is becoming more familiar with in Canberra, Ganyao, or a koel. And the koel would, in the evening, settle on the top of a native cashew tree. And the word for the koel, is guak, guak, guak. You've probably heard the sound of it in the night. Guak, guak. So then it was eating the nuts of the ganyao, and there you can see them up there. It was accompanied by 2 other animals, emu and a possum, which you can't see them directly here. They accompanied them. The possum would climb up and down the tree at night, and the possum would be spinning its fur into lengths of possum fur string. And on the outside there, this is a length of possum fur string spun by guak. The emu was there getting water for them, and the emu would be digging its feet in the ground, and where it dug in the ground, water would come springing up. And in the middle of this painting here, there you can see that pattern signifies the lake at Djarrakpi. And so what the sort of simple part of the story is these 3 ancestral beings traveling across country, making lengths of possum fur string, making water, and making encampments on the top of native cashew trees. Nice, simple story. Then there's the journey. Well, the journey, the guak, after in the morning, when all the possum fur string had been strung, would seize it in its mouth. And here, there, you've got the guak bending down. There's the length of possum fur string. There it goes. And he flies off with it. He flies off with it to the next place that he's going to land and rest. And he gets very tired because this possum fur string dragging him down. And eventually he dropped it. And it forms features of landscape below. The final destination, which Narritjin would always refer to as the guak's promised land, was Djarrakpi. And this painting is of Djarrakpi. this can become a map of Djarrakpi. So in the middle here, you have the lake. So, the emu scratched out, didn't actually find water. The guac laid the length of possum fur string down on this side of the lake, great long length of possum fur string that formed the margins of the lake. On the other side of the lake, and we'll say that's the other side of the lake here, well, actually, there were already two ancestral women called Yolngu, and they actually didn't have then any possum fur string. They didn't have anything to enable them to bind spears, make dilly bags, or make pubic covers and things like that. They tended to hide away from other people, and they say, "This is fantastic, gosh, possum fur string." And they went overboard. They made mountains and mountains and mountains of possum fur string in this area here. So this forms basically a large sand dune that separates it off from the sea on that side. So this is a map here of Djarrakpi at the end of a journey in which the repetition of the acts, and if there is a place where there was a native cashew tree at the end of the far end of the lake. So there you've got this, in a sense, beautiful, but in some ways archetypal Yolngu painting because of what it's doing. And the designs in the middle are designs that are associated with the Manggalili clan, with its backbone, and a painting that would be done on an initiate's chest would be that square area in the middle. You cut all the figures out and you paint it, but then the whole meaning of that painting would be in people's minds, coming through songs, coming through dances, and coming through experiencing the landscape. Yeah, I could talk about this for the next day. This is the Yingapungapu, so this is the same place. This is to do with the ancestral women who were there before. Here we have at the top the ancestral women, the Yolngu, and they're sitting under a ganyo cashew tree, and there's a little guac sitting on the top, you can see there. Okay, and they have an ambiguous relationship with the guac. They were both of the same moiety. The Yolngu did produce children for the Manggalili clan, and gave birth to them, and also for other clans of the Yirritja moiety. They fed from fish, parrotfish in particular, that were collected by their brothers, the guacs, when they went out to sea. There you can see there's a little canoe that would have gone out into the sea. There are the sort of fish spears and woomeras and so on and so forth. There we've got the emus that I was referring about, scratching around looking for water. This is the seaside, so you can see the sand crabs there at a place called Gungoi. In the middle, what's this curious shape here? Well, when they'd finished their meal, if there were any fish remains, what they would do was they'd scoop out an ellipse in the sand and carefully bury the remains of fish there. So it was a kind of benediction, giving back to the land, giving back to the ancestors, and also a way of cleansing the place where they'd been eating. Then their brothers, the guacs, died one day out at sea. They were standing on the top of the sand dunes, looking out to sea. No. Then a few days later, the dead body of the guac, who was in human form then, came up on the beach. And what they did then was they laid his body in exactly the same shape, where you can see the fish remains now, but on a much larger scale. And that particular thing, called a Yingapungapu, is the ceremonial ground sculpture that people of the Yirritja moiety use today to sometimes put the body of a dead person within it, but also then to perform afterwards cleansing ceremonies that bring people back into a joyous and continuing life. And those images at the bottom there, okay, are complex images. They represent, if you turn yourself on your head, that is the top of a cumulus cloud. That's the bottom of a cumulus cloud rising out to sea. So when they're stopping at the top of the dune, looking out to sea, there they saw the cumulus clouds coming up. And then the songs about the cumulus clouds say, oh, cumulus clouds out to sea, billowing out like women's breasts. This is in the center, the cross. You can see the cross there? I'll take my hand away, then you can see the cross. That is a breast girdle made of possum fur string that women wore. So that was one of the things that the Nyapalil. So this storm out of sea both references a big storm. The canoe of the boat was overturned. The body goes back to the sea, but it's also the ancestral women themselves that reincorporate, if you like, the body, the spirit within themselves. Again, wonderful painting. And this is a painting of the opposite moiety. This is a painting of the Dur moiety of the Morokolo clan. And this is a painting that was done by Bolkara Maymuru, Manggalili man, brother of Narritjin, and it's his mother's painting. And Bolkara was the senior, if you like, child of women of the clan, boy, child of Owaku. And the role of people like that is often to set designs in ceremony. So as well as painting your own clan design, senior people connected to their mother's clan will also produce those kind of designs in ceremony. And this is a painting associated with the Junguan ceremony. This was one of the paintings that was at the original exhibition, Yirritja Art. And very wisely, I don't know why, the ANU bought this particular painting, as they did the previous one, and made it part of their collection, so they sure you paid full price. I think this is a wonderful painting. You can actually see another of Ian Dunlop's films. This is a long film called Yolgnu and Banapana, which is what he calls it, a film monograph. And this is of that ceremony. And you can see paintings like this and discussions of them, not by Bolkara. Bolkara was there and you could see him doing a face painting. But the person who did the main paintings there, Dundiwoy, Wannabe, and Midley, Wannabe, members of the Morokolo clan. And you can see them talking about the meaning of a painting just like this, beside a sand sculpture that it also represents. So there's another sand sculpture in this painting. And that sand sculpture is would be a geometric, elongated triangle, which is the Junguan ceremonial ground, or the Molk. Okay, so what's the narrative of this painting? Many narratives, but let's first of all imagine we're inland, and there were some ancestral women who were collecting honey inland, high up in the hills, by cutting down trees, because when you get honey from the tree, you have to actually cut the tree down. It's an old tree, rotten in the middle, full of honey, extract honey. And then where they cut the tree down, on one occasion, there were two goannas in it, water goannas, inside the hollow tree. The tree went cascading down from the inland, gouging out the path of the Gorkaway River in this case. And this is the gouging out of the river here, and it ended up in the sea. The goannas were the tree was smashed to pieces, and today you can see it continually regrowing in the form of the mangrove trees that are in the water's edge. The goannas were transformed into stone, and you can see little rocky bars going out from the shore into the sea, which have speckles of sort of white within them that are the bubbles that are coming up from the goannas. That's how you see them beneath the water. You can see bubbles coming up and you can trace where they come from. So there you see them. So you've got the goannas there on either side. You've got the course of the Gokaway River. And in the Jungan ceremony, people reenact those particular ancestral events where the women dance, find the stringy bark tree, and it's a stringy bark tree, and then cut it. Okay, so there. Again, well, this we can go through incredibly quickly because this is actually the boat out at sea signaling the Guak who are out there, or the two Mokoi, people who are halfway between ancestral beings and humans. And there's the boat that they were in, there's the paddle. They were out hunting turtles. The storm out at sea is associated with an ancestral turtle. The boat was overturned. These are not the men in the boat. These are the two women on the top of the sand dunes, looking out to sea, but then crying in mourning, cutting their heads in mourning on the sand dunes. And there's the indication of the event. And you can see all sorts of elements, but there are the paddles floating in the ocean after the boat was overturned. So, but you can see now how that sand sculpture, which is a yingapunga, also echoes the shape of the boat that they were out to sea. And this is a dugout canoe, painted from above. Yeah. And you can see the breast girdles at the bottom there, and then the paddles. Okay.
So is it a common practice for Aboriginal people from the Manggalili clan or other communities to paint with the mawat, the brush of human hair or an equivalent? Why was it important to Narritjin to paint with a mawat?
Well, people still do paint with feathers, with brushes of human hair. Why? Well, how would you paint the kind of cross-hatching that you see here? What kind of brush would you use? Now, you can actually use other brushes other than human hair, but on the whole, people do use a brush made from human hair. Marwat is the word for hair. Okay. Other things that people used to use, I mean, today everybody uses brush of human hair. I mean, there are certain sort of theories that it must be, the brush of, hair from a younger woman or something like that. But those theories are not actually formed in practice. People will look for someone with the longest, thickest kind of hair and seize it from them. So my hair has often been used in hair brushes. And indeed, the one that's on exhibition in the National Gallery of Australia is my hair. There you are. Might not be an exhibition at the moment, but it often is. You can also use the inner sort of frond, the middle of a kind of palm leaf. Okay, that you strip off, and that will have the same effect, but it won't last nearly as long as a hairbrush will. There is the symbolic significance of, because when people are painting, when they're sitting, and the way you paint also relates to the question, because the cross-hatching is produced by laying the brush on the surface and then drawing it across one after the other. So you need a long trailing brush that brings the paint along with you. So that in effect creates also an even layer of paint as you do it. So technically it's well adjusted to that. In fact, I'm not so surprised that Winsor and Newton and others don't sell a hairbrush, a nice thin hairbrush to go with it. I don't think they do. It's
No.
interesting. It would be a very good thing. Okay, what's its symbolic significance? Well, people, when they're painting, always stress that the paintings are coming from their mind, their thinking. And in the, what's it called? What's the depression in the middle of your skull called? The fontanelle. Good job. You remember it. You stimulated it. Okay. So in the middle of your skull is something called the fontanelle. It's the part where all the sort of bones sort of join up. When you're a young child, this is the bones haven't come together yet, so it's soft. It's like a waterhole. Yolngu, imagine it. And so Yolngu see this as, in a sense, a location of knowledge from the mind. So when you're painting with your hairbrush, which comes from hair that surrounds the fontanelle, you're actually transferring knowledge from your mind, which entered your mind through your conception spirit from the ancestral dimension. So it's a medium for transfer ancestral knowledge through human knowledge to your brush, through your hand, onto the painting.
That's incredible. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. So can you speak?
You can probably skip that one.
Yeah.
Start to talk about it.
So the ANU art collection currently holds a piece, Yangaruni
Yangarin, Yangarin,
Yangarin Manangmura,
Wunangmura.
that was involved in the first successful Indigenous copyright case back in 1983. Could you particularly talk about this piece?
This piece was also one of the ones that the ANU brilliantly bought from the Yirritja art exhibition. Look, this painting, I love this painting. This painting is extraordinary because I was traveling, in fact, with Narritjin and his wife, to a funeral at a place called Gurumuru, a homeland centre in the middle of a wetland, south of Arnhem Bay. And we were, in those days, it was a journey of about 10 or 11 hours. And we arrived at the place at sunset. An incredible light was shining on the settlement of Gurumuru, the homeland of Gurumuru. And we were coming down over a slight hill. And then I saw on the top of a corrugated iron hut, in the distance, this painting shining back at me. And look at that painting, it's unbelievable. Isn't it so beautiful? And when we got there, I knew it must be by Yangarin, who I'd worked with and had produced a lot of Brennex boards for me in the early days. I was now living there. And so I was able to, buy it from him there and then. And it became one of the sort of central works for the Yirritja art exhibition, and the ANU bought it. And it's a painting of the waterhole at Yolngu, which is one of the main sacred waterholes of the Yirritja moiety. And the Wunangmura are one of the two Dalawamu clans who are the right holders of this place. Now, this is an inland freshwater place. It's the site of an ancestral fish trap that is made by directing the flow of the river in a particular direction, where you put a woven mat across the river with a a weir, the dam, and the fish jump up and get stranded on the mat, and you pick them off. And so you can see this area here is the mat. There are the fish jumping up. Those are ancestral vanilla freshwater turtles, and those are freshwater crayfish. So this is really a painting of that ancestral fish trap in the sort of, if you like, the sort of early dry season. So, but it's a glorious, glorious, glorious painting. I thought it was a glorious painting. And when all these things come around in circles, well, Bob Edwards had ceased to be the director of the Aboriginal Arts Board and become the director of what's it called? Major Australian. It's the Australian Gallery Directors Council or something like that. We'll say it was the Australian Gallery Directors Council. And he decided that it was very, very important to curate an exhibition of Aboriginal art, material culture in Australian art galleries. And so I was involved with him in the curation of this exhibition with John Mulvaney, Nick Peterson, Carol Cooper. So it was kind of an ANU exhibition with the key gallery, the National Gallery of Victoria, and someone called Judith Ryan, subsequently a really renowned curator of Aboriginal art, was there, the assistant curator working with us on the exhibition. And so the exhibition opened at the National Gallery of Victoria, travelled to Western Australia, and then the AGDC, something like that, became bankrupt, so it was supposed to travel further. Anyway, this was one of the paintings in the exhibition, one of the paintings in the catalogue, and of course, what happened was that an entrepreneur seized on the design and got it printed into lengths of cloth, I think, in Vietnam, and Yangarid became aware of that. And so it became the initial copyright case sponsored by the Aboriginal Artists Agency of the Australia Council, and they won. So it was coincidental, I suppose, well, very coincidental. I didn't have anything to do with it becoming a work of cloth, but indirectly it was in the exhibition, so it became something that became well known, and therefore, oh gosh, this is design. The interesting thing about the copyright case is that it was something that I believed before. I couldn't see. I mean, it was almost like the Creative Arts Fellowship Committee saying, "Oh, well, these things they can't be artists because they're collective works and so on." And they were saying, "Well, copyright. Well, they can't copyright them because they're not sort of individual." The idea that something had to be individual to be copyright, I don't think that ever has necessarily been the case. I mean, there's a sort of history of the process of copyright as it developed in European context that eventually gave individuals a very central right in that process. Anyway, so they tested it in the court and they found, gosh, we don't have to change the copyright law at all. All we have to do is provide the funding for people to take breaches of copyright to law. And that is so often all that it is needed, except that then people weigh that up. And just like this company, I think, went bankrupt as soon as the case was over. There's not much money to get out of it, but it's very important that people now know that actually Aboriginal artworks are copyright just as much as anybody else's works are. And they have then introduced, I suppose, in practice, it turns out that indeed the, if you like, collective ownership of works of art by a clan or a group can also be recognize that in asking permission, one actually has to consider who the set of right holders are as well.
So do you think, from your perspective, that the art world respects Indigenous cultural intellectual property, the ISIP rights? Do you recall any other instances where ancestral designs might have been taken out of their cultural context?
Oh, well, that's a really difficult question. Look, the whole issue of copyrights. This is a very straightforward one. And there's a difference between, you could argue, copyright and appropriation. But then that's very difficult. Because if you look at that particular painting there, with the diamond design there, well, human history, diamond designs are everywhere. So, when people will produce something that someone will say, oh gosh, that's an appropriation of a Yolngu, you can find it being an appropriation of so many others. So the extreme end of copyright, in terms of copywriting a design as if it's a logo or something like that, when it's not a logo, can be problematic. The other famous cases that happen problematic for me are colour with sort of the carpet cases where design of late Pandak Marikas, the goannas at Yirritja was made into so they won that case, but again probably the company went bankrupt. So you have to weigh those kind of things. But I think, look, it's it's difficult. It's one of the rights that needs to be enforced, but at the edges, it enters into areas of ambiguity. Yolngu will say that anybody using a Yirritja didgeridoo actually is stealing a musical instrument that is theirs, because didgeridoos were not played outside Arnhem. They're an instrument from that part of the world. But some of the great indigenous Yirritja players, didgeridoo players, don't come from that place at all. And then so there you think, gosh, this is very complicated. So who has the right to play a didgeridoo as a musical instrument? You think, oh gosh, yes, well. So, it's complicated. So I think there are simple areas, and there are, they always have, edge into complex and contested areas.
So in 2001, you wrote, for Indigenous art to be seen on equal terms with Western art, it requires more than the right to an isolated space. The viewer must also have access to its history and significance. Do you think the presentation and interpretation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artwork has improved? And if so, what ways? Have we, Western society, gotten any closer to understanding Aboriginal artists than those of the Paleolithic period of 15,000 years ago?
Right. Look, I think that there's still an enormous amount of misunderstanding about these things. I think it's now getting clarified. I think one has to understand that there's no reason why you can't understand almost any object on aesthetic grounds. Now, depending where you come from, your criteria and what your experience of the world with are going to be very, very kind of different. So, the idea, anyone who is an artist feels in a Western context, if you give them something, because we're terribly eclectic and so on and so on, like, well, could you talk about the aesthetic dimension of this? There's probably nothing that a particular kind of artist would say that, oh, I can't say anything about that at all. You can always, if you're looking at something from that frame, put it in that kind of frame, which is great. And that's one of the reasons why art works across cultures. There's no doubt that a painting like that we've seen here could be really widely appreciated. And you can see echoes of those particular forms right across the world. So that's not a problem, okay, in that sense. The problem is when people say that it is sufficient that works of art are appreciated on the basis of form alone, and that indeed that is the appropriate environment in which to evaluate them. And I would argue that's an appropriate environment in which to evaluate things in terms of their pure form, isolated from any cultural context, and evaluating those things in their pure form. If you had an art gallery in South America, India, the Upper Paleolithic, Northern Australia, the community would be evaluating those in completely different kinds of ways. So art history, and also then subsequently the appreciation of what art was at that moment in time in that place, involves knowing something about that particular context. So we can't zoom people back to the Upper Paleolithic. We can appreciate we can actually have as research projects, how do we think that art was seen at that moment in time? So we can reconstruct a particular viewing that, which will give us a different way of looking at that art, as well as using the art for a different kind of purpose. Exactly the same with art history. You can use art history to decide what is the structure of religious values in the sort of late Renaissance, and how does it relate to the value of the people who own the stately homes and so on. So you can ask those questions that you go from art to the history, and then you can also ask, well, how was that art seen there? And then if we put it in the context of a particular church or a particular stately home, how were those things seen different? And what about the people who were looking at them? How did the peasant who was working in the fields see that differently from someone? So these are all questions about vision and aesthetics that help your understanding. So I think that it is incredibly good if works of art in general have these special places where you can see them without being too interrupted by other noise around them. It's actually rather like when I try and look at my desktop, which has the ANU logo behind it with all that writing on black and white, I find it incredibly difficult to find the thing that I'm looking for. So when the thing that I'm looking for, and I know I'm going here to see this beautiful painting like we're looking at now, actually it doesn't help to have long-necked freshwater tortoise written beside it. No, that can go for that particular kind of purpose. So, and there are ways now, so many ways of getting around that particular problem. Because I would want to know about this. And I said, why don't they, who's the artist? They don't even put the artist's name. This is ridiculous. Have the artist got no age? Where's it gone? No, there's got to be a certain amount of any minimal information that is readily available. But there's got to be access to other forms of information, because that's all. In the case certainly of Yolngu, people say that again and again. Jambo Maruli says it again and again in particular. These are not just pretty pictures. Narritjin, in the quote that I came on, these all have meaning. That's why they want, but they don't say this all has meaning, so we've got to have a great big long text beside it here and now. But we've got to ensure that people are able to see what it means to us, both in terms of it's then a reflection of basically what our intentional production of this art entailed, because we weren't doing it just so that you'd look, it was beautiful. We want you to understand a little bit more about us, but it also enables you to see it from a different framework. So instead of having a really sort of general idea about this particular painting, and a word that I started using for the first time, shimmering brilliance, to do with Aboriginal art, suddenly within a few years was repeated absolutely everywhere. But Yolngu actually have a word, which really can be translated as shimmering brilliance. what does that mean in this context? It's quite different from the meaning that shimmering brilliant would, mean if you were actually thinking, oh, this contemporary kitchen, what's the best way that we can actually, oh, yes, do you see what I mean? So it becomes, you get these general terms that then become sort of meaningless because
So I've been.
they're not meaningless in the sense that they actually are pointing out universals about the ways in which human brain senses and categorizes certain kinds of things. But anyway. Yeah.
So I've read that you've been working on the development of the concept of the relational museum recently.
Yes, right.
How might you apply this framework to exhibitions of Indigenous art?
That's an incredibly good question, isn't it? Okay. In a way, that actually comes into the question that we've just been talking about, because what you have to do in the case of the relational museum, it's arguing that there's a kind of matrix of connection between different times and different places that connects the maker of an object sometime in the past with the people who bought that object then, the context in which it has been in subsequent, how it's been valued differently at different periods of time, and how you can then connect those things together for different reasons. When we're talking about the Upper Paleolithic, it's a very good reason to bring that kind of thing in. How was the Upper Paleolithic seen in European history? Well, first of all, when rock art was first discovered, it was almost certainly thought it was made by, people a few years earlier or fraudulently or something. It changed eventually people's conception of how long, human beings had been producing works that we could, many years later, recognize and start to think of it in different ways, partly also aesthetically. It had a huge aesthetic, and then how do you incorporate that in, contemporary production? Also, the way that, say, a lot of African art, but also prehistoric art at the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries was an inspiration of what people decided was, freedom of form, primitive instinct, all that. Okay, so at one moment of time, it was connected in that particular way. But then, and that's a valid thing to look at that point of view, because it's telling us something about the history of Western art, ideas, and how those particular kind of things change. But do you then have to, in the case of Upper Paleolithic, go back, how do we change our understanding of what we were as Western Europeans like 15,000 years ago? We suddenly become very close to these people. It changes our attitudes. So that's interesting. So when it comes to exhibitions of Indigenous art in an art gallery context, we must be very cautious of what I would call presentism. We are now able to see these as true works of art, which our forefathers failed to. So that's one sort of area where, in a sense, challenging ourselves in the present to understand that there is a much more complicated past that left us to getting to where we are now. But we also have to say, well, what are these people now? How could we connect this to them? What is the relationship between this here, now, and then? How can we, in the context of Australia today, start to really provide the kind of resources that enables people to connect to collections of these fine art works in museums? And that opens up this whole thing about the kind of resources that need to be produced that connect people to both the sort of past, but also, in a sense, to areas of sort of discourse in the present. So it's just a relational museum concept is something that opens it. There are certain really concrete things that you do, which are very easy. You actually say, when we're doing an exhibition at the Drill Hall Gallery, do we now contact the Arts Centre? And do we engage with them? Do we see what the artists would feel about which paintings should be there and so on? And in the Yolngu case, nearly everybody will say that's fine. But giving people agency to the extent that they want to in the present, but understanding after what that you need to learn that you're putting, if you're not careful, huge impositions on people. That a very, very good example of it. I mean, Yolngu, in some ways, although they want their rights very much to be respected and understood, hope that people in an institution will now know a lot about that. So they won't have to all the time be asked question after question after question after question after question. They don't have time to do all that. They're hoping you've learned something. That's what Narritjin is saying here. I mean, a very good example, I think, was when the saltwater paintings were exhibited here. I can't remember. A whole series of Yolngu artists down there. And I'd been asked to introduce people and say a few words. And then someone came up and said in front of me, oh, well, people would rather, Jambo or someone like that was the first person to talk about this, because I said, there you are, Jambo. Jambo looked at me and said, what do you mean? That's your job, he said. I'm an artist. You talk about artists, I make art. So could you do it? Sorry. It's but it's interesting. So in the contemporary context, these things are incredibly sort of complex. But that relational museum in that context is you're establishing relationships with people. You're building those kinds of relationships in the present. And then you're, in a sense, trying to work together to build connections with past histories and events. And in a way, to bring those connections forward. And they're going to be messy in some cases, but also you're going to say, well, now how are we going to deal with these things? How are we going to deal with these kind of contracts? Yeah.
So finally, I guess, playing off that idea, so the appreciation of art transcends time, space, and cultural differences.
Yes.
Do you think that this relational museum framework and the respectful appreciation of art, Aboriginal art, plays into the wider discourse of reconciliation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does unproblematically, as long as people recognize that this is really complex, that we need to bring forward those complexities. And if we have a really simple, I mean, you were talking about this earlier on, there is a very, very, very long history of non-Indigenous engagement with Indigenous Australians to try and change Australian attitudes, and in particular get changes at the level of sort of government. We must not forget that. We must build this into our history. And at the moment, if one's not careful, we're suddenly building into our history an idea that Aboriginal people, the Great Australian Silence, was completely, absolutely true until whatever moment it was now. Maybe, the referendum. Oh, it changed at the referendum. Oh, maybe it changed with Mabo. Maybe it's now going to change with a voice to Parliament. No, this is all part of a really complex historical process where the present is never going to be the end of a process. And we need to bring that whole process, forward so that we actually allow for diversity in the present as well as diversity in the past. I mean, that's the whole thing, and there are sort of great things about an Australian and what Indigenous Australians, some Indigenous Australians, but what you've got to understand is that there are many different, societies. There are many different Indigenous Australian people. we need to acknowledge that particular kind of difference. And then how do you measure that then with, say, a statement like, a very sort of simple statement, but, acknowledgement to country is something that all Australians have done at all Indigenous Australia, at all periods of time in all sorts of places. It really can confuse you because if you actually go to Northeast Arnhem, you're not going to find anybody acknowledging country in that particular kind of way. So it is a much more complex kind of relationship, introduction, sets of rights and so on. Now you can't, so you actually have to see that as something that is very valuable, very important, but it's very important in the present moment of consciousness raising. And you don't have to make all Indigenous Australians suddenly doing the same thing, because that's what, it then becomes institutionalizing. Okay.
Well, thank you so much again for speaking with us today. And we hope you enjoy your visit to Yirritja next time.
I will do. Take some of the